All right, get ready to dive deep into electronic music. We're going to trace it back to its roots, and it's a lot more surprising than just plugging in a synth. We're talking like over a century of sonic pioneers breaking boundaries, sometimes with, let's just say, interesting results.
Yeah, it's wild how the whole idea of electronic music started way before the tech was even there. Like, imagine the late 1800s, no laptops, no digital anything. But people still wanted to make sounds you couldn't get from regular instruments.
And that's where this guy, Thaddeus Cahill, pops up with his telharmonium.
Oh, yeah, the telharmonium.
This thing was huge DE. I mean, it used tone wheels to make electronic sounds, but good luck taking it to a gig. It was like a power plant just for music. I guess you could say it was ahead of its time. Maybe a little TO ahead of its time, right?
For sure. Definitely ambitious for those days. But Cahill wasn't alone, though. Around the same time, you have the Italian Futurists. This group was obsessed with all the sounds of the industrial age. They even built these crazy noise-making instruments called intonarumori.
Wait, intonarumori. Tell me more about those, because that name just sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Okay, so picture this. Big boxy things with horns and cranks, each one made to make a different industrial noise. They used them in concerts, like a symphony of just clangs and hisses and rumbles. Talk about a sonic shift.
Whoa. Okay, so from those early experiments, we start to see actual electronic instruments emerge. And I gotta admit, when I think early electronic music, I think that wobbly, spacey sound. The theremin.
Yeah, the theremin, and everyone knows that sound. It's iconic. But people don't always get it. Sure, it ended up in a ton of sci-fi movies, but in the 1920s, composers were writing serious music for it.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
That's wild. Imagine trying to play something where you don't even touch it.
Right, you're controlling the pitch and volume by moving your hands through electromagnetic fields?
It's like conducting air.
Basically.
That takes serious skill.
Yeah.
But the theremin wasn't the only new instrument out there, was it?
Nope. In 1928, along comes the ondes martino. This one you actually played by pressing a keyboard, but it had this haunting sound, almost ethereal. It really captivated composers, especially over in France.
Okay, so we've got these new electronic instruments popping up, but I'm guessing not everyone was ready to just ditch their violins and pianos just yet.
Right.
How did the more traditional music world react to all of this new stuff?
Well, it was mixed. Some people thought it was just a fad, others were curious, and then some were, well, let's just say not so happy about it. But there is one instrument from this time that kind of bridged the gap. The Hammond organ.
Ah, the Hammond organ. I've heard that in everything from church hymns to like bluesy jazz.
Oh, yeah.
It's technically electromechanical, not purely electronic, but it definitely paved the way for people to accept those, non-traditional sounds.
For sure. The Hammond organ brought electronic sounds into people's homes and their everyday lives. It wasn't this strange experimental thing anymore. It was on the radio, in clubs, even in people's living rooms. It helped folks get used to hearing sounds made electronically. But the real game changer was just around the corner, and it involved this little thing called magnetic tape.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. We're moving into the 1940s and 50s, and suddenly it's not just about making electronic sounds, but capturing them and messing with them in ways nobody had even thought of before.
Right.
I feel like this is when electronic music really starts to find its own sound.
Yeah, you're totally right. Magnetic tape recording, it wasn't just for preserving music, it actually became part of how you made the music. Composers could cut the tape, splice it, loop it, speed it up, slow it down, reverse sounds. It was like having a whole sonic playground right there. And this led to some really different approaches.
Like Musique Concrete over in France, where they used recordings of everyday sounds, everything from street noise to birds singing, to make these super evocative soundscapes.
Yeah, Pierre Schaeffer, the guy who pioneered Musique Concrete, held a concert in 1950 that was kind of a turning point. Imagine going to a concert and hearing music made from trains, bubbling water, crackling fire. It really messed with people's ideas of what music could be.
On the other side of the spectrum, you had electronic music developing in Germany. This was all about sounds you made electronically, like sine waves and stuff you couldn't get from normal instruments.
Exactly, yeah. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen was a big name in electronic music. Him and the others at the WDR studio in Cologne, they were obsessed with figuring out every sound they could get out of electronics, pushing the limits of what could even be called music in some pretty wild ways.
So even though these two movements had different approaches, they both wanted the same thing. Break free from the limitations of old school music and go explore this uncharted territory of electronic sound. It's like they were each mapping out a different part of this new sonic landscape, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And it's important to remember that this wasn't just happening in Europe.
Nope.
All over the world, composers were experimenting with electronics, using them in their own musical traditions, creating some really unique blends.
For sure, it was global.
Like, I'm thinking of John Cage in the US, who was already kind of out there with prepared piano and chance procedures. Then he started using turntables and recordings in his work. It's like he was constantly looking for new ways to make sound, you know.
Cage was a true innovator, always challenging what people thought music should be. And his influence went beyond just his own music, too. He mentored other artists, collaborated with them. It was like this ripple effect of experimentation, pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
It's crazy to think how much was happening in the mid-20th century. All these seeds being planted for what electronic music would become. But I have a feeling things are going to get even more interesting as we move into the era of the synthesizer.
And that's where the synthesizer comes in. Well, not just any synthesizer, the one that changed everything. The Moog.
Okay, I've definitely heard of the Moog, but I don't really know why it's such a big deal. Was it like the first synthesizer ever, or what?
Not the first one, no. But it was the one that made synthesizers, I don't know, doable for anyone who wasn't like an electronics whiz or working in a university lab.
Gotcha.
Before the Moog came along, most electronic instruments, they were either giant custom-built things or just way too expensive for, your average musician.
So Robert Moog comes along in 1964 and basically says, hey, you don't need a PhD to make electronic music.
Exactly. The Moog was modular, which meant you could plug all these different parts together, create your own sounds, and it was relatively affordable. So suddenly bands, studios, even some brave home musicians could actually get their hands on one.
I bet that opened up a ton of possibilities.
Yeah, it does.
I'm picturing musicians just going nuts, twisting knobs, patching cables, just totally letting loose with sound.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the sound itself, it was the way you interacted with it, shaped it in real time, made it respond to your touch. It was a whole different way of thinking about making music.
So how'd this impact the music scene as a whole? Was it just like the avant-garde folks messing around with Moogs?
Oh, no. It went way beyond that. It got into pop, rock, jazz, even classical.
Wow.
Wendy Carlos's Switched on Bach in 1968, that was huge. Introduced a whole bunch of people to Bach, but played on a Moog.
Can you imagine hearing that for the first time back then? It must have been mind-blowing. Like familiar, but also totally alien at the same time.
Absolutely. And it's not just individual artists either. This is also when you have the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, this legendary sound design studio. They used electronic music to create all these soundscapes for radio and TV.
Oh, right, like Doctor Who.
Exactly. Doctor Who, all those eerie, futuristic sounds, that was them, defined the show for generation.
Oh, that's so cool. Speaking of iconic, gotta ask about Kraftwerk.
Oh, yeah.
They were pioneers in electronic pop in the 70s, and their influence is still huge today. What was it about their sound that really connected with people?
Kraftwerk, they were all about embracing technology, not just as a tool, but as a theme. They sang about robots, computers, the modern world, all with this hypnotic, pulsing electronic music. They were futuristic, minimalist, and totally unique.
They really captured that moment in time, didn't they? Like all this technological progress, but also this, anxiety about where it was all going. And they did it with music that was both catchy and made you think.
Yeah, exactly. And as electronic instruments became more and more common, there was this growing need to connect them, make them talk to each other. That's where MIDI comes in.
MIDI. I feel like I've heard that a million times, but to be honest, I don't really know what it is or why it matters so much.
All right, so think of it as a universal language that all electronic instruments can understand.
Okay.
Before MIDI, if you wanted to connect, say, a synth to a drum machine, it was a nightmare. Cables everywhere, custom interfaces, all that. MIDI made it all standard.
So suddenly you could use instruments from different companies together, control them all from one place, even record what you were playing digitally.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about making things easier, it opened up all these new creative possibilities. Sequencing, synchronization, automated performances, a total game changer for making electronic music.
Okay, I'm seeing the pattern here. The Moog made it possible for more people to create electronic music. And then MIDI changed how all that music was actually made and shared. Like each innovation set the stage for this explosion of creativity, right?
Yeah, it's really remarkable, but it doesn't end there. The digital revolution was about to hit the music world hard.
Digital music. It's weird to think that's even like a thing we have to say now.
I know, right?
It's like everything is digital.
Pretty much.
But back then, this was huge, right?
Oh, yeah, it was massive. It changed everything, really. And it happened on a few different fronts. You had these incredible new digital instruments like the Fairlight CMI.
Yeah.
This came out of Australia in '79.
Right.
One of the first really usable digital samplers. So you could record any sound, a piano, a dog barking, whatever, and play back on a keyboard.
So it wasn't just about making sounds from scratch anymore. You could actually grab real-world sounds and mess with them in ways you couldn't before.
Exactly. Open up a ton of sonic possibilities, especially for film and TV composers. Suddenly you could make these super rich and realistic soundtracks, or just go completely crazy with, weird otherworldly soundscape.
But it wasn't just sampling, right? Didn't digital synthesizers start to, take off around this time too?
Oh yeah, you're thinking of the Yamaha DX7. Came out in '83 and just blew everyone away.
A DX7, okay.
It used this totally different way of making sound called FM synthesis. You could get these super complex and expressive sounds.
Okay, gotta be honest. FM synthesis, that's a little over my head.
No worries.
What made it so different from the old analog synths?
Okay. Think of it this way. Analog synthesis was kind of like mixing paint.
Okay.
You have your set colors, you mix them to make new shades. But FM synthesis was like having a prism, splitting light into all the colors of the rainbow. You could make sounds with way more depth and detail.
So the DX7 wasn't just another synth. It was a whole new way of thinking about sound design.
Exactly.
No wonder it was on so many hit records in the 80s.
Totally. It had this really unique, crisp sound that kind of defined the 80s. And it was pretty affordable, too. So it ended up in studios and bedrooms all over the world. Just kept pushing that idea of anyone being able to make electronic music.
It's wild to see how it all came together, from those first experiments to being able to create a whole song on a computer in your room.
Right.
Talk about human ingenuity. Always pushing the limits of what we can do with sound.
It really is. And that's what's so cool about electronic music. It's always changing, always trying new things, pushing boundaries. Who knows what the next big thing will be, right?
Right. I mean, we've gone from instruments the size of a room to synth apps on your phone.
It's crazy.
What's next? AI composing symphonies. Music you control with your brainwaves.
Who knows?
It's pretty mind-blowing.
And that's the beauty of it. The future of electronic music is totally wide open. But one thing's for sure, it'll keep challenging what we think music is and who gets to make it.
So as we wrap up this sonic journey, what's the big takeaway? What do you want our listeners to remember?
I'd say this, electronic music isn't just a genre, it's a spirit. It's about being innovative, experimenting, pushing those boundaries of sound, and that spirit's still going strong, finding new ways to express itself all the time.
I love that. So to our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, gotten you interested in exploring the world of electronic music. It's vast and always changing, you know? Who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to create the next big sound.
Keep those ears open. Keep those minds curious.
Until next time, keep on diving deep.